listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the honor of interviewing Karl Beckstrand. Karl is a college media instructor and has worked in many different fields of writing, including writing numerous children's books. As you'll learn during this interview, Karl does a wonderful job incorporating cultural diversity into his work as an author. I'm here with Karl Beckstrand. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did, thanks.
Who is an author and a media professor at a public university, among many other things. Karl, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm glad to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay, well, I grew up in San Jose, California, and I lived abroad for a couple years in South America, and I got my undergraduate degree in journalism from BYU, and I got a master's degree in political science. I know that's strange for a children's author, but I wanted to study it. It's something I like. And I had my 27th book published last month, or 2 months ago.
Now, what countries have you visited during your lifetime? You mentioned South America, but there's a lot of countries in that part of the world.
Yes, so I lived in Chile for 2 years, just stopped briefly in Lima, Peru. I've been to, of course, Mexico and Canada, and been to Turkey and Bulgaria and Ukraine and Romania and Spain. So yeah, nice mix.
Quite a globetrotter there.
Now, I think travel's the best education you can get.
Now, without spoiling too much of any of your books, what are some of your books about? And you said you were a children's book author.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've written in many genres, but most of my books are children's picture books. So multicultural books. So I try to have diverse characters in the books. I have Spanish-English books with pronunciation guide. I have a series on a nonfiction series on immigrant children. And I have careers books, wordless books, a cookbook for kids, mysteries for minors. So a good mix.
Now, have you done writing work outside of published books? And if so, what types of writing work have you done?
Yes, I've done all kinds of writing. As I mentioned, my undergraduate was in journalism, and so I've done a lot of press releases. Never was a official reporter, except for the school newspaper, but I liked having the ability to write, and being able to write concisely is perfect for writing for young audiences. So yeah, I've also written, web content, scripts for TV, radio, and film. I've written a Western novel, a self-help book, short stories, a romance, so quite a mix.
Now, in your work as an author, how is cultural diversity reflected in your work?
So growing up in California, especially the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, it's a very rich, diverse culture. There's people from all over the world in the South Bay. And so when I was a kid, I remember reading children's books, and a lot of the characters were blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids, and I thought, well, that doesn't represent the world that I see. So I determined that if I ever wrote books for kids, that I would try to represent a nice mixture of cultures.
Now, overall, not just your books, but the book and literature industry as a whole, do you believe that different cultures and culture diversity are well represented in literature?
I think we're finally getting there. I have friends that write books that include even children with physical challenges. So diversity is finally being represented in publishing. But it's taken decades. It's kind of surprised me.
Now, I'm going to get to the part about self-publishing versus traditionally publishing that I typically ask here in a few minutes, but there was a rather interesting uh, unfortunate event that occurred the first time you went to have a book published. Is it true that the book publisher died on the day it was to be printed?
Yeah, yeah. It was just a small local publisher, and he got food poisoning the day we were going. Well, the day before we were going to print, and he said he'd be fine, but the next day he passed away. It was a real shock.
A very sudden illness. My dad, a couple years ago, passed away a lot more suddenly than that.
Wow. Yeah, it was a mixed blessing. Of course, I felt terribly for his wife and his family, but one thing that came out of it that was good was that I had to quickly learn how to promote my books, and from that and a couple other experiences with another publisher, I eventually started my own publishing company from all the things that I learned.
Now, are all your books self-published, all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
Yes, so two of my books were through publishers, and then the rest of the 27 I did myself with my own company.
Now, do authors have to put in a lot of marketing work regardless of whether their books are self-published or traditionally published?
Absolutely. Yeah, the lion's share of the marketing always is the job of the author because the author is the one who knows the story best and is most passionate about it. And no one else can be as passionate about your story as you are if you've written one.
Yeah, a phrase that I like to say is that the best book marketer is the author.
Yeah, it's really true. And so, yeah, publishing houses can help you, but really, self-published or traditional, you've got to be the marketer.
Now, in your some of your illustrated children's books, did you do the illustration, or was there like a mixed bag of you doing the illustration in some and having illustrators work with you on others?
So yes, I've illustrated about five of my books. I've had professional illustrators do the others. One book was kind of a collaboration with an illustrator, so we kind of each did our part, which is actually one of my favorite books. It's called The Bridge of the Golden Wood. And yeah, that those illustrations turned out amazing. I think because of the collaboration.
Now, what is it like to be a media professor at a public university?
It's great. I started teaching at Utah Valley University, teaching journalism, which is just something that I feel passionately about.
What part of Utah is Utah Valley University located? Because
Sure,
eh,
it's the valley just south of the Salt Lake Valley. So I live in the Salt Lake Valley, and just a few minutes south of here is Utah Valley.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, because that's not one of the bigger universities in Utah, like the University of Utah or BYU.
Well, it's not one of the more known one, but I think it's one of the biggest universities in the country, Utah Valley
Oh,
University.
I did not. Yeah, because they don't have a big athletic program like a couple of other schools in Utah. Uh, the
Yeah, they're getting
University of
there.
Utah Salt Lake City and BYU Provo.
Right. Yeah, BYU is close to there. Utah Valley is, um, as far as student population, is probably one of the largest in the country. So yeah, they are getting some good sports teams too. They're a newer university, but huge.
Well, Carl, that was my final question, so I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. If you wanted me to contrast a little between traditional and self-publishing, I can give some pointers for some authors.
If you want to do that right now, go ahead. I've not stopped the interview yet.
All right. So um, traditional publishing, with the big publishers, always has had prestige and continues to this day to have great prestige, and that's a benefit. That's definitely something worthwhile. But I found that in my experiences with publishers, they control content of your book. They control the money. They control the marketing. And I just learned over the years that I'm a little bit better at the marketing than they are because I'm passionate about my books. I don't like to have my content altered significantly by outsiders, and I like to keep the profits. So that's probably my biggest argument for self-publishing, and it's so much easier these days with
The
print on
internet
demand.
and print
It's
on
easy to.
demand. I mean, those are two big innovations because prior to the internet, self publishing a book was not totally unheard of, but it was rare.
Right. Yeah. And um, big publishers used to have a monopoly on the big distributors, but that's not the case anymore. I've had agreements with Ingram, Baker and Taylor, Follett, Brodart, and so I don't necessarily need to be a big publisher to have access to the major distribution. In fact, my books are listed on Walmart.com and Target.com, and so a little person, a tiny press can have good representation. Again, you don't have necessarily the prestige, but you have the distribution you need. You have the technology available to facilitate getting your book to anybody, and you can control the content and your profits.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to both self publishing and traditional publishing. And prestige doesn't really matter as much nowadays in American society as it would have, well, before the internet.
Right, right. Still, if Penguin Random House contacted me, I'd consider their offer. I'd look it over.
Well, Karl, you've been a wonderful guest for this podcast, and once again, thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you, Aaron. And if anybody wants to find my books, of course they're on Amazon. They're also on premiobooks.com.
It's always great to interview an author who does a wonderful job incorporating cultural diversity in his work, and I enjoyed interviewing Karl. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.